My name is David Hartful from Black Leader Analysis, and I'm here to talk about part 3 of the Crucible. In this part, we'll talk about some of the main influencers for the book, The Crucible. And the 4 people that I picked out that are mentioned frequently in The Crucible are F.W. de Klerk, Jan Smuts, Nelson Mandela, and Shelby Steele. And so these are the people in the book that he frequently goes back to as examples of integral thinking. He says Jan Smuts is the greatest thinker from South Africa. He also says that Shelby Steele is one of the examples of integral thinking in the African American community. F.W. de Klerk was the leader during Don Beck's time of South Africa. And the book mentioned Nelson Mandela infrequently, but the main thing it talked about was him putting on the Springboks jersey and coming out during the rugby game in the 90s that South Africa won the championship. So let's start with F.W. de Klerk. He was from a family of successful politicians. His uncle was a prime minister, and his father was National Party secretary of the Transvaal. The generation that preceded de Klerk established apartheid. So his brother, Wilhelm, was one of the founders of the Liberal Party, which is the current day Democratic Alliance. So early in FW's career, he was a National Party hardliner. So he believed in the National Party through and through. He believed that apartheid, he believed in apartheid and did everything he could to preserve it. And even currently, when he speaks about apartheid, he always refers to it as the time of separate development. And he doesn't see that it was fundamentally or morally wrong. It was just implemented incorrectly in South Africa. One of the things he continually says is Yugoslavia has a version of separate development, and they set up separate countries, and it worked. And the reason it worked was because they were able to split the resources up more evenly, whereas in apartheid, the whites hogged too much of the resources. So early in de Klerk's career, though, he'd be considered a Gravesian, in Gravesian terms, blue. So he believed in the National Party, he believed in the dogma, and he didn't really want to move off of it. But as time went on and the economic sanctions really took their toll on South Africa, F.W. de Klerk decided to become the man that would revolutionize South Africa. So he organized the release of Nelson Mandela and worked with many white South Africans to support change. When he spoke to businessmen, he spoke to how apartheid wasn't sustainable for their business and they would have to give it up eventually somehow. When he talked to other blue meme hardliners who believed in the traditions of Afrikaner South Africa, he was clear in letting them know that what they wanted wasn't morally wrong, it was just not tenable with the current situation. He always contended that independent homelands weren't bad. So as I said earlier, he supported apartheid in the homelands, territorial homelands. He called it the time of separate development. It wasn't immoral, and it was done in other places. He also talks about how all countries at that time had some version of apartheid, whether it was American segregation or Indian caste system. They all had some similar type of program. Now, de Klerk is a controversial figure because he is believed to be one of the people that was in control of what they call the third force. So during the time of township violence, you had many African liberation organizations fighting each other, such as IFP in the ANC or Azania People's Organization in the ANC. And the entire time this was happening, it was speculated that members of the government were supplying the different factions with weapons and also strategically assassinating leaders to keep the violence going on. Now, F.W. Klerk declares that he didn't know anything about any interference from the government. As time went on, they were able to prove that different members of the government were sanctioning assassinations and supplying Soviet-era guns to different liberation organizations under the guise of it was coming from the communists. So de Klerk continues to declare he didn't know anything about that, but it's hard to believe sometimes because he was a leader of the National Party. So a lot of people don't believe him when he says that. He does currently believe in black economic empowerment, which is South Africa's affirmative action. However, he wants to modify it so it is more friendly to all South Africans. One of the things he says repeatedly in talks is, if only 25% of the graduating engineering class is black, you can't set aside 50% of the jobs for them. Because he's bringing forth the issues many white South Africaners have and Afrikaners have with the BEE program, is that their children can't find a job because of set-asides for Africans, and their kids are having to go to Australia or Canada to find work. So he does ultimately want to move away from racial distinctions simply towards values, because he was heavily influenced and personally advised by Don Beck and the Gravesian system. And the next person we'll talk about is Nelson Mandela. So Mandela was originally jailed in the 60s for a government sabotage campaign. So what he did was him organized with many other ANC members under a new organization called MK. MK stands for Spirit of the Nation in the indigenous language. And so MK formed as an offshoot of the ANC, and they would scout different government buildings, and they would wait till the building was empty, and then they would plant a bomb in it or come up with some kind of way to sabotage it. He eventually was caught and sent to jail. Now, 20 years later, in 1981, they moved him to private housing. Part of the reason because the time of township violence was starting to flare up, and they needed a black leader to calm everybody down to bring stability back to the country. So negotiations for ending apartheid happened with Mandela separately than other ANC members. So people think there was some issues there where they're trying to manipulate a situation to be in favor of Afrikaners and European or white Africans. So upon release, Mandela basically focuses on reconciling black Africans with white Africans. And he ultimately embraces neoliberal policies when he leaves and he becomes president. It's important to understand Nelson Mandela's arc. A quote from the 1964 trial that put him away. In his defense, he says this following thing. Today, I am attracted to the idea of a classless society, an attraction which springs in part from Marxist reading and in part from my admiration of the structure and organization of early African societies in this country. The land, then, the main means of production, belonged to the tribe. There was no rich, there was no poor, and there was no exploitation. So that was his original economic philosophy before going to prison. Now when he leaves prison, he goes to Davos in 1992, and he explains a somewhat Marxist plan for the future economy. And after much deliberation with the panel at Davos, he realized that nationalization won't work. And also South Africa was needed of a massive IMF loan to stay afloat and not go bad on its loans. To secure the IMF loan, he had to agree to certain terms as far as nationalization. He He had to find neoliberal economic advisors. He began to cut taxes, put property rights paramount in the Constitution, and support privatization and globalization. These acts grew the economy, but they didn't spread the wealth to the black masses in the speed that most black Africans want. So the criticism of Mandela on the left is that they don't like when he asserts that blacks need whites to teach them how to run the land. When the white people arrived, Africans were maintaining the land and using it and improving upon it and getting wealth, extracting wealth out of it. That's how white people realized that the land was valuable. And ultimately, if there was no redistribution of wealth or land from white Africans to black Africans, then nothing fundamentally will change. Now, the exact method to do that is something that can be argued. But if there's no movement of wealth, then blacks will always be poor, and they'll always be in a situation where they can easily be exploited. And redistribution is morally valid on the basis of redress. So black Africans have been oppressed. They haven't been allowed to do this. They haven't been allowed to get educated. They haven't been allowed to be in business. And unless they are gather some wealth, then they're not going to be able to move forward. And that's why many on the left consider the reconciliation done by Mandela simply symbolic. Now Jan Smuts. So Jan Smuts was actually a leader from the early 1900s, and Don Beck thinks he was one of the first integral thinkers. And his philosophy of holism is something that's used as a basis for integral theory and how second-tier thinking goes about. So Jan Smuts is really like a founder of a predecessor of integral theory. And integral theory is based and comes out of holism. So if any South Africans are watching and you study holism, you probably would like integral too, and I suggest you follow the site. So Jan Smuts in the Crucible is portrayed as a leader of the Boer commandos until the end of the Anglo-Boer War, and then he advocated for the Boer people within the English Commonwealth. And he supported the British imperial government, and Smuts demonstrates superior leadership and clear thinking and being a reasonable person. Smuts distinguished himself as a philosopher by creating holism, and holism is the idea that systems, physical, social, and mental, are a sum of smaller wholes, not a collection of parts. And each whole is in itself composed of smaller wholes. So each whole is at the same time independent and dependent on the larger whole. So to go a little bit more detail in Jan Smuts' life, he was educated in Cambridge, which is one of the leading institutions for English education. And so Cambridge's mission was to create great leaders for the British Imperial Empire. Okay? Upon leaving Cambridge, he worked for Cecil Rhodes, who is now known as one of the main colonizers of Africa. Cecil Rhodes founded De Beers Diamonds, and which was one of the primary colonizers. Rhodes believed Africans should be forced off their land and then brought back onto it as laborers to stimulate them to grow. So Rhodes attacked Boer settlement without contacting Smuts first, and Smuts felt betrayed by this. And that's when Smuts joined the Boer army and fought against the English. So after the war, Smuts goes on to form Hek Volt to advocate for the Boers within the Union South Africa, that eventually becomes the United Party. And the United Party is in opposition to the National Party. So the United Party looks at South Africa as a piece or a whole within the British Commonwealth. So it's the South Africa as a whole, composed of smaller wholes, which are the provinces, and it's part of the whole British Empire. So that's how holism goes into politics. Now, the National Party was pro-Afrikaners building their own independent nation and working for what's best for the people within South Africa. So his political life centered around South Africa as an agent of the British Empire. And he later he formed the Union Party, and so he became a prominent British imperialist during World War I, when he attacked and took over all the German settlements in southern Africa. Germany was expanding in southern Africa, and many historians say the German expansion in Africa and Asia threatened England, and that's one of the main causes of World War I. He also supported South Africa fighting in World War II alongside Britain. Now, most Boers were siding with the Axis in Germany at the time. One, because they still see themselves as ethnically German. Most of them come out of Holland and other Germanic-speaking areas, and Franks from France. They consider themselves a Germanic people. And they saw anything good for a Germanic people as good for them. And they saw themselves as ethnically German. So they wanted to side with the Axis, and many Afrikaners worked as spies during the World War II. Now, many of them also fought, again, with Jan Smuts, and were distinguished and are hailed as South African heroes too. So, and Smuts also violently repressed various Afrikaner labor disputes. So after the Boer War, a lot of the Afrikaners became miners and other, we call blue-collar jobs in America. And so naturally, they wanted to form labor unions and fight for their rights. Now, Jan Smuts, being an agent of the British Empire, would always back the capitalist. And when there was riots, and they wouldn't, not riots, but labor strikes, he would use violence to suppress the strike, and it would end up turning into a riot. And the same thing happened in America, but I mean, so that's why Jan Smuts wasn't really popular with a lot of the Afrikaners. So Jan Smuts' view on the British Empire. So I'm getting this from the 1917 speech he did to the British House of Parliament on his views of the British Empire. So he first says Britain is a commonwealth and not an empire, because the British Commonwealth is composed of the empires of Egypt and India. So it's more than an empire. And Commonwealth is the best term that he could come up with at the time. And he thought there a new term should be created to describe the British Empire, because it's so much greater than anything the world's ever seen before. And the British Empire is a commonwealth as a dynamic system of independent states moving to a similar goal. So he thought World War I victories over Germany weren't just to fight a war over territory, but they were to secure a future. And so he believed that they all should work, all the different states of the Commonwealth, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, India, Egypt, Sudan, that was called the Egyptian Empire back then. They should all work for common goals, but the method of them attaining the goals should be developed at the local level. So the goal wasn't for the betterment of the independent states, it was for the betterment of the unit as a whole. And so because all these smaller wholes were acting semi-independently, you couldn't have an elected official run the Commonwealth. You needed a king, because there's no way that somebody could win votes in Jamaica, South Africa, Australia, all these different places all at the same time. So that is why he supported having a king and not an elected official. So Jan Smuts' view on world politics, I'm getting this from the treatise called The League of Nations and World Peace. So the book detailed what he thought the League of Nations should be. So Jan Smuts is actually the brainchild for the League of Nations. It was his idea. He came up with the structure and all that. Now in America, we're always told that it was Woodrow Wilson, because we're Americans, want to take control of everything. We want credit for everything. But Woodrow Wilson really was kind of like the salesman, whereas Smuts was like the thinker, okay? So the League of Nations goal was to arbitrate disputes, regulate arms and war, facilitate development of backward countries, and not to stop war, but to make it illegal, because there's another way for redress. So at the moment, before the League of Nations, if two countries had a problem, they basically have to go to war. But after the League of Nations, you could bring the problem to the League, and the League can arbitrate it. Now, he also believed that everyone in the League of Nations doesn't need to have equal say. He thought the British Empire, France, Italy, the United States, and Japan would be considered the major powers. And then intermediate powers would be countries like Hungary, Turkey, and Russia. And then the balance of countries would be a lower tier in it. And he actually says in the treatise, should Guatemala have the same voting power as the United States? As a rhetorical question, that's like, of course they shouldn't. So he doesn't even consider the idea of all the states just being equal and voting straight up. He didn't even consider that a possibility. So he also says that newer and backward countries could benefit from the tutelage, as in they would grow and become more like the major powers of Italy, America, Britain, and all those, and France, and those kind of places. Again, and he said that the League won't stop war, it'll just make it illegal, because people would be expected to go to the League for arbitration before just coming to blows. So Smuts on Africa. So Smuts outlined in his views on Africans in the 1929 series of lecture, Africa and some other world problems. So his views were that Africans were inferior. He also thought that the propagation of European civilization in Africa was a boon for Africa, in that they would learn and grow and, again, be more like the Western cultures. So he also outlines two extreme native policies, okay, for the black African. So one extreme would be to treat him as an equal, which Smuts affirms he will never be equal, and we should never even try to make him equal. The other extreme was to turn him into a beast of burden for capital, and he said that was cruel and inhumane. So his plan, he felt, was in the middle of those two extremes. So he believed that Africans should be able to compete for jobs on an equal plane with whites, and that's for skilled and unskilled labor. But the African shouldn't be able to live in a city with white people. He should go back to his territorial homeland, and his family should be in the territorial homeland. And so the homeland would be run by African chiefs, and the chiefs would go to training to make their homeland as close to Western civilization as possible. So they would have tutelage from whites on how to run things. And over time, the African homeland would get more and more autonomy and independence. And eventually, it would be like its own separate province. But he said they got to do everything they can to keep black families from moving by white families, because then the Africans become urbanized and they demand equal rights with white people. And they can never get equal rights with white people. So Jan Smuts is often portrayed as somebody who was very progressive. That's not a progressive view in 1929. I mean, it's better than a lot of people, yes. It was more liberal than most people, but there were people in 1929 who thought black people were equal. And he mentions them in the treaties, and he says they're like crazy. So, and again, he wasn't popular with Afrikaners, generally because he fought against German interests. He had Afrikaners shot in labor strikes, and he acted against Afrikaner nationalization. He had a very brief stint in the Boer War where he was working for the good of the Boers, but he ultimately worked for the British Empire. Okay, and another influencer in the Crucible is Shelby Steele. Now, Shelby Steele is an American, and he's a contemporary of the time the book was written in the 90s. And he's a conservative radio and TV personality at the time. So Shelby Steele is the person who coined the phrase white guilt. And he believes that America is not endemically racist, although isolated racist incidents do happen. So, again, white guilt is a motivation for affirmative action. So he says affirmative action is bad because it forces black people to perform less for the same reward, which makes black people weaker. So he should say that race should be pulled out of it and everybody should be on the same playing field. And that white guilt is just a way for white people to absolve their guilt from the past, and it really doesn't fix anything. And he doesn't believe that anything needs to be actively done to fight racism. We just need to remove bias and put everybody kind of on the same playing field. And that he says the biggest problem in Black America is family planning, and the family planning leads to high illegitimacy rates, unstable households. The unstable household leads to high crime rates. And he says that blacks should just take personal responsibility to fix their own issues. And Shelby Steele doesn't ever delve deeply into how various systematic things in America created a wealth gap that in turn created unstable communities that led to high unemployment and high illegitimacy rate. He never goes into that. He assumes it's all just personal choice, and if you make better personal choices, things would be better. So I told you all that to say this. So the Crucible is very much a conservative-leaning book, and the people that he had influencing him were deeply conservatives. So when you're reading the book, understand where he's getting his information from, and that if he had different people influencing him, the book would be a very different book. So it's definitely from more of a conservative slant, and if you're interested in it, highly recommend that you buy the book. It's a great way to learn integral theory, but the solutions he comes to in the book are chiefly conservative solutions, because he was influenced by conservative thinkers who believe that there needs to be this long tutelage period between black people and white people before any wealth transfers happen or any power transfers happen. So the whole book is written around that idea of we need this long tutelage period to grow and come up to the level of the rest of the world. So hope you liked the video. Please like it. Subscribe to the blog, www.blackleaderanalysis.com. And if you have any questions, hit me up in the comments or sdnrace@gmail.com. Thank you and bye.